very warm welcome to the E-Lounge. 7 October 2021 marks the 90th birthday of one of South Africa's most prolific leaders, Africa's Peace Bishop, honored with the Nobel Peace Prize for his opposition to the brutality of apartheid regime, a living legend, Archbishop Desmond Tutu. In honor, in celebration, and gratitude to this legend, our book on review this month is titled Desmond Tutu, a spiritual biography of South Africa's Confessor, written by Dr. Rev Michael Battle, who himself was ordained a priest by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Rev Battle is a Herbert Thompson's Professor of Church and Society. He is the director of Desmond Tutu Center at General Theological Seminary in New York. Insights, inspiration, stimulate great conversation. The E-Lounge is one of our knowledge share platforms anchored on our values of learning and leadership. We do hope that you'll tune in, engage, take away the knowledge from this great conversation, and always remember that those who desire to lead should read. Thank you.
Mutlaba warakenamile. Loosely translated, the antelope said, I am very fast. And the desert said, I am very vast. And it is in that sense that you could never ever know a man's character. It is as vast as the sands of the Khalahadi. It is as vast as the sands of the desert. And in that sense, when somebody asked, why would you write another book about Desmond Tutu? My guest today said, there is another dimension you people have never looked at. There is another dimension that is very vast, that is deeper than the knowing of man, that is deeper than the essence of the mind, that is beyond your ability to be able to grasp what has made Desmond Tutu, as we refer to him as the Arch, the Confessor of Africa, and the Confessor of the world. Reverend Dr. Michael Battle, welcome. You are no stranger to our shores. My guest today is Dr. Reverend Michael Battle, and for ease of what they call it of the conversation, I'll just refer to him as Michael. Now, I could love to introduce you. You've written so many papers, you've written so many spiritual writing, both on the life of the Arch and on your understanding and your growth through the church. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Seppo.
First and foremost, who is Michael Battle in the beginning? And how does, as a lot of people are sitting there at home asking themselves, how does a man from Atlanta get to be the one that tells us this part of the story? Because there's a lot of parts of the story, and I'm reminded of an incident I had when I used to be in consulting. There was a man who kept a crystal that was polished on one side in his office. And when he sensed an argument coming on, he will take it and put it on top of the table to remind us both that we are not seeing the same side of the argument. Now, you saw a different side to the Arch. But first and foremost, who's Michael Battle?
Yeah, I mean, to catch your attention and to be a bit provocative, I'm an amphibian. And what I mean by that is I'm an African American, and I've lived in both of those worlds. Usually, when I'm living in one, I'm longing for the other. So being an African American has been difficult and has shaped the way I think, how I see. It's shaped my worldview. And it's given me the great gift, I think, of, as you've introduced our time together, to see things from different angles. And so being able to swim in the waters of African identity, you know, being able to swim in the waters of being an American, which is a bit offensive to say that the United States is America, because you also have Canada, you got Mexico. That's all a part of North America. But my identity has been a creative vantage point to see the world.
Now, I wish I could start at the beginning of the book. But as I said as we were chatting, I am intrigued. Literally 2 months or so, in essence, we wouldn't have known before Chris Hani was shot. The most volatile time that anybody could have traveled to South Africa, you made the pilgrimage. Where does that start?
Yeah, it was baptism by fire, because I initially was trying to make a decision for my PhD dissertation at Duke University. And I was going to study Oxford bishop named Kenneth Kirk. But my intuition told me, you know, people have already studied these sort of European white bishops. And I had this epiphany, you know, and the epiphany really came from what did I really want to do? And it sounds strange that you've got to really look at what you really want to do in academics. But in some ways, you're socialized not to do what you really want to do, whether that's through who your supervisors are or through the pressures of trying to make it through a PhD program. But I came to that conviction of what I really wanted to do was to study Desmond Tutu. And my university gave me a hard time at first, but thankfully I had a wonderful PhD supervisor who supported me to work with Archbishop to study Tutu. And the reason I had a hard time with the rest of the university is they said, well, he doesn't have a body of work, written work, which is a very Eurocentric way of understanding academics. Through providence, serendipity, Tutu was on sabbatical at Emory in Atlanta. I was at Duke University in North Carolina, and it's about a 6-hour drive. And I had a chance to go down and meet with the Arch. And when I went with my hat in my hand, going to break this subject to him that I wanted to do a PhD on him with this theology, because I felt like most people only saw him as a political agent. But again, going back to the vantage point that we started out with, to really take seriously him as a theologian and as a spiritual leader, the first thing he said was, "Let us pray," when I walked in his office. And when he said that, this no longer became an academic work. Existentially, I understood that this was going to be a vocation. And it certainly has turned out to be a vocation, because ever since then, in 1992 till today, in October 2021, as you said, I've written a lot. I've got 12 books. Many of those books have some aspect of Tutu's themes, his witness, his leadership. And it became my vocation when he said, "Let us pray." Hence this spiritual biography, and trying to help people see the foundation from which he was able to do the things he did. And just like you know, most of us don't do the things in our own backyard. People from around the world come here to South Africa and see the things, oftentimes I would bet that even you haven't even seen, because you know this is your home, this is what you take for granted. For Tutu, I would say it's a similar dynamic, that you sort of take him for granted as almost one of your founding leaders of a true South Africa, but oftentimes, just like not really taking seriously what's in your own backyard, I think many people don't take seriously his spiritual life, which I think is profound.
Talking about his spiritual life, maybe let's drift out a little bit. Talk about African Christianity. a misnomer in the world's view, but and more African spirituality is more understood than African Christianity. In your work and your volume of work that you have done, how do you define that? Because the world struggles with it. Because remember the notion that to be holy is to be different from one. Yeah. And we will get back to how apartheid was created. But let's talk about this African Christianity and the sense of holiness and saintliness.
I think you put your finger on a key aspect, and that's most of the world thinks Africa is the object to be missionized, to bring Christianity to the continent. But it's really the other way around. Christianity, in many ways, the cradle of it is this continent. And, for example, monks and nuns, the monastic movement that many people associate with the Roman Catholic Church or the Eastern Orthodox Church. But Christian monks started in Africa. And the whole is going back to the whole tradition of spirituality. The desert fathers and mothers, they started in Africa. The ways of praying and contemplation started in Africa. But the branding of what it means to be African in our sort of current sense, it's an oxymoron to say African Christianity. But a lot of that is the problem of colonialism and the dysfunctional ways in which we understood what we call missiology, the study of missions. So yeah, I think hopefully what comes through in this book is that, you know, the home of Christian spirituality is in the blood of somebody like Tutu, or you, for that example. And the African identity carries with it the particularity, I think, of so many Christian principles and also historical segments of Christianity.
In Ethiopia, and the book called the Kebra Nagast, the Book of Kings, the book that alleges that the Ark of Covenant is hidden here in Africa and in Ethiopia specifically. But we're digressing. Now, in essence, you then arrive here, and you're given access to the library and the filing room in Bishop's Court.
Even the stuff you wrote on napkins,
yes.
I had access to all of that. The envelopes, back of envelopes and things.
And right there and there, your mission to document the spiritual life. What is that light? What is that guiding note beyond him saying, "Let's pray"? What is that light that the more deeper you went? And I got a sense in the book that you have another volume coming. Unless I've gotten it wrong, but in my reading a book, I know when a sequel is coming.
Well, you got good intuition. Yeah, I think it's almost, and I'm not trying to over simplify or to make things grander than what they really are, but in some ways, it was like I was one of those witnesses in the Bible, trying to tell an epic story. And having access behind the scenes like that was a huge responsibility. And to make sure that a person who is spiritual like Tutu, he's not going to try to show the public his spirituality, but trying to show the public that you pray or to try to show your spirituality. Jesus got angry at a lot of people who just tried to show their spirituality. You know, the work was to be the spirituality. So people like Tutu, you know, they're not going to toot their own horn about how spiritual they are. So it was a lot of responsibility for me to be that kind of a reference point. And for me to try and be as careful as I can to show the integrity of someone behind the scenes as just as much of the integrity of what he's doing in front of cameras or preaching at political funerals. That's a lot of responsibility. And so when he gives me access to what he's writing on envelopes, when I'm praying with him, what we call the daily office, praying with him like 3 times a day, that's a lot of responsibility. It's a great gift, but it's a lot of responsibility. And so this book is a product of that responsibility. The world needs exemplars. And the best exemplars are not the ones who are going to be the opportunists.
In the midst of all of that, he teaches you an African phrase. Certain things are not taught, they're caught.
Yes.
And you caught this one.
Yes.
It is an African phrase. I never thought anybody could actually translate it into English. Because
he loves that phrase.
Yes, certain things are not taught; they're caught. You catch it. It's like a disease. You inhale it, and from then on, it's what you become. Like I tell people, I've got trains in my veins. That's all I have in there. So there's nothing else there. So you catch this, and it's now your life. Now, I will get to the point, of the march and all of that, and ultimately you becoming the chaplain. But let's go back to the Arch himself. The Arch himself, in his ecumenical sense and his worldliness about religion, transcends, in actual fact, religion in itself, but actually spoke more about him being more of a spiritual person. Now, amazingly enough, and as you say, your kid says you must be careful of making him look like a superhero. Because every superhero is taught by a monk.
Yeah.
The relationship between, Father Trevor Huddleston in Sophia Town and ultimately in Rosentonville and all of those places, and how ultimately Tutu's or the Arch's view of life becomes. That is an important part. I mean, if you bring us in a little bit into that sense of the understanding of the fact that, not only did he learn to be, ultimately learn theology and all of that, but he also leaned towards more the monastic sense of belief.
As you know, studying social psychology, for a person to know how to be human, they use this term of imprinting upon identity. So social psychologists will teach that a baby duck, a duckling, has to imprint on the mother duckling by just trying to waddle just like the mother duck. That's called imprinting. Tutu imprinted on these monks. They were, especially Trevor Huddleston, the Community of the Resurrection was the religious order for monks that Trevor Huddleston was a part of, coming from England. And so Tutu, in many ways, imprinted on that identity of prayer, of doing things for the sake of the action, not for the sake of being seen. Prayer as real. God is real. And imprinting on these monks, I think, created these habits, and that's another big thing for spirituality, is this word habit. Created these habits that have sustained him in ways in which he really shouldn't be 90 years old, coming up on October 7th, because of all the illnesses he had as a child. But I think those habits increased his health, increased purpose, and many people, social psychologists included, say when you have a purpose, you live longer. So for Tutu, the purpose of confronting apartheid and not just doing it on a whimsical kind of way or a short-term kind of way, but a longitudinal way, even to see it fold. I think it really goes back to that imprinting upon a society of nuns and monks who will outlive and have the tenacity and the longevity to see the change that they're praying for.
Now, let's go back to the structure of the book a little bit, because I want to talk to you about the sense of purgation, illumination, and ultimately the union.
Yeah.
And the three stratas of as one's ability to grow in their beliefs and in their spirituality. Now, in the area of purgation, and as he goes through everything, to him, in a very mystical manner, it starts from a very young sense, in the sense that at a very young age, he could already see, the ills of apartheid. White kids being fed in school and them throwing away their own lunch, and black kids going to look for that lunch because it was still fresh. And all of that. But his sense of reality had already started forming at that point in time, and his ability to say, I want to change the world, had already started at that point in time.
Exactly right. Yeah. So, yeah, that whole threefold process, purgation, illumination, and union, is the heart of Christian mysticism. And so Tutu's first stage of purgation, he was born into something that needed to be purged, apartheid. And he was aware of that growing up, and you gave some good examples there. And I think as he grew up, he had even more of a reference point of how apartheid was deadly in its accumulation of changing people's world views. So, for example, it was deadly in the sense that some people began to normalize it, both on the white side and the black side, to normalize this as the way things should be. Thank God, of course, we had the prophets, we had those who resisted that normalization. But I think for Tutu, that purgation wasn't just political. Apartheid was evil. And also, I think an insight that Tutu had was that whether we like it or not, this was something that some people saw as a spirituality, saw apartheid as a religious kind of worldview, that those who were the architects of apartheid saw themselves being with God and God being with them, and creating a society in which the white identity needed to be set apart.
This is an important issue, and I think to me, I had always understood where apartheid came from, but it's the sense in which you define it. And in actual fact, in one of the lines you say, you have to note that actually apartheid is religious business.
Yes.
I think probably enlighten us a little bit more, because it's without going into it, because we want to talk about the arch, but it's an important realization, and it's incredible how you say that you must not forget that in actual fact apartheid was built on the notion of holiness, of being different from the other.
Yeah, I mean, apartheid is really the same word as holy, to be set apart. And the worldview of the Afrikaners who constructed that concept, many of them were seminarians, D.F. Milan and others who came up with this worldview. And they saw themselves as being preferred by God to lead a people through ignorance, to lead a people through the wilderness. And they saw themselves almost like as the new Israel. God had chosen them as a chosen people. And apartheid was a way of being set apart to lead the heathen in many ways. Yeah, and it's just going back to where we began in terms of, things in your own backyard. You may not actually see it. You just see it only as a political system. But apartheid in many ways was a religious, if not even a spiritual system for so many people who constructed it so that you felt like the purpose was from God. This wasn't just a political purpose.
Now, in the first stage of purgation, you have to actually do something important, and that you raise, and it's something that the Arch repeats time and again. And for as long as I've been aware of his writings and his speeches, he says it is impossible for one to be one with God, but hate his neighbor.
Yeah.
And it's one of those important things. I still remember in the olden days, they used to say the reason why the cross goes up like that and it has a line that goes across is that you have a central relationship with God, but a world's view of the world of relating with, with thy neighbor. Now, this is an important part of the Arch's teachings.
Exactly.
In what way did that not only impress upon you as you were imprinting, but ultimately you learn about Ubuntu
Yeah.
and its relationship with whatever they call it?
Yeah,
Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, that's the heart of Ubuntu, what you just said. So remember I talked about habits, right? So the Arch would have heard what you said about loving God and hating your neighbor as a huge disconnect, but he would have heard that in praying every day through Scripture, because it's actually in 1 John. It's in the Bible, where the writer of 1 John says, "How can you love God whom you have not seen, while you hate your brother and sister that you do see?" And so Tutu, in his daily habits of prayer, reading the Bible, understood that worldview as a disconnect. And it helped him to embrace the brilliance of his own cultural worldview of Ubuntu. And that cultural worldview was the opposite of that disconnect of saying that you love God while you hate your brother and sister. You know more about the sort of phonetic and definitions of Ubuntu, because that's really a Bantu word for to be human. You know the language, you know the cultures around what it means to be human. But for someone like me, an amphibian, outside in the Western world, I only really know to be human as sort of this individualistic, competitive identity. So Tutu was living in the best of both worlds. He had this beautiful African worldview of Ubuntu, and he had the spiritual habits of taking 1 John and wedding those two together to really be sort of the touchstone experience for his leadership of really challenging this spirituality of apartheid as being hypocritical, challenging it as being sinful and heretical, and also helping Black folks to see that it's not a zero-sum game that we're after. We're not trying to win to make our enemy lose. We're trying to win because that's the purpose of God's creation, for all of us to win. And I'm sure as we will talk in our conversation, that gets Tutu in trouble on both sides, right? It gets him in trouble with the Black leadership that really wants to see the change, and the Black leadership does not want Tutu to be co-opted in the white leadership, because usually Christian leaders in colonialism, Black Christian leaders were co-opted in this colonial world to be the tools of the empire to keep people in their place. So the Black leadership was very much worried and often angry at what they saw Tutu as being a sellout. And also many of the criticisms of him being the chair of the TRC play out in that regard. And then, of course, Tutu was very much challenged by the white side as a threat, a political leader, that kind of person who was going to bring down the empire. So he got it from both sides in that kind of conflict and conflictual world.
In that conflict that, in purgation, one goes through this, the level where you are struggling with being human, if we were to put it in the simple sense.
That's a good way to put it.
And being able to, get rid of the rituals that make you what we view as human. You get everything together, put together your thesis, and in the middle of all of that, you also write a book. Centrally in and around Christianity, African Christianity and Ubuntu.
Yeah.
Now, one of the most interesting thing about this book is that Tutu's journey and your journey are highly intertwined. You get to the States and the book gets rejected. What is the sense that you carry with you during that time? And it's such a strong point of view, and you're introducing new ideas to the world, and now suddenly, the
That's
very
right.
narrow view of the world says this is not strong enough.
Yeah, I think that's good insight. I think there were parallel things going on in my own life in terms of trying to make this book known in the academy, as well as the same sort of parallel that I was trying to say that Tutu was caught in between. And I think what the saving grace was, history always reveals the truth. And one of Tutu's favorite sayings is that this is a moral universe and justice always leans and moves toward those who are on the right side of history. So I had, as you said, the vantage point of a very crucial time of South Africa having its first real democratic elections. And the world began to change because the world outside of South Africa saw this as a recalcitrant situation like the Middle East, right? And they didn't think South Africa was going to change. But South Africa was a model, especially with the TRC as an experiment. Not to say that there haven't been other Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, but there's never been a Truth and Reconciliation Commission as focused on restorative justice. So those were in my favor in terms of getting the book published, my initial book on Tutu published, as well as I think the world seeing the genius that Tutu is. That, here's one of the nation states that's not stuck in that cycle of abuse and violence. Of course, South Africa has troubles, but the celebrations are just magnificent. Again, in your own backyard, a fish doesn't know it's wet, but the world sees that, perhaps in the future, nation states can practice more restorative justice than retributive justice.
As he's building up during purgation, the concept of nonviolence, it doesn't develop. It's part of who he is as a clergyman and as what do they call it? As now, this conflict rages on because there is the urgency of what must happen, and there's also telling, the world powers that, or the powers that be, that if you do not, I can only preach nonviolence for so long. It's quite a profound statement in itself.
Yeah.
But nonviolence in itself, beyond it being a monastic thought and part of that earlier bit of it, in what sense do you think that develops initially in Tutu?
Yeah, we talked a little about this before we went on air here, but South Africa is an unusual geography because it's produced some of the greatest articulators of nonviolence. And I don't think that's accidental. You know, Mahatma Gandhi's Satyagraha, for example, Albert Lutuli's Nobel Peace Prize, of course, Nelson Mandela. These are almost like biblical epic kind of spokespersons and articulators of peace. So the nonviolence, there is something in the water we drink here in South Africa that has the intuition that the world can actually achieve these ideals of human societies that are different, coalescing in a way that the particularity of the difference doesn't have to go away, but it's becomes symbiotic. The difference becomes symbiotic with other differences. And, you know, if you look at the rest of the world, you don't really have many other nation states in terms of that concept of what a nation state is that has really articulated that symbiotic nature that difference can live with each other. You in South Africa has one of the best constitutions in the world that testify to what I'm trying to say about human differences should not get in the way of a healthy government. Human differences really should enhance a better society. And I think the purgation aspect of Tutu's life was trying to cleanse the veil, the scales on our eyes, especially to say that difference was meant to keep people in their place. And so those scales now have fallen off of our eyes, and I think South Africa now is seen in the world as the leader in this kind of symbiotic way. I know it may not seem like it because of the monumental challenges that we all face, especially this apocalyptic way of trying to address COVID-19. But still, when the dust settles with this, what is going on in South Africa with this experiment of trying to bring difference together without a zero-sum game, I think you're winning.
At some point in time, I had a thought, we might be the true Israelites still being stuck in the desert for 40 years. And but I left that idea alone. But Tutu also understood one simple thing. You can only pour from a full cup. You cannot pour from an empty one. And in your time with him, you learned quite a lot about the rigor of prayer and being able to find silence. One thing I struggle with, and over a period of time as I get older, I do take those moments to be alone and to not be in meetings and just simply think. Or sometimes not even think, just to be able to refill. Now, let's talk a little bit about that and probably how it has influenced your own life and in being able to reflect on issues.
Yeah, even, Seppo, in the business world, spirituality is becoming a valued practice. Because I know many businesses, especially in the States, they will go on retreats now, and they will bring in people who can lead meditations and help people when they're trying to figure out strategic plans. Contemplation has the value of creating the habits, I think, of longevity. It comes down to that. When you can stop and not panic, which if you gave in, left to your own devices of panicking, the end is near, right? But if you are in the water and you think you're about to drown and you listen to the voice telling you to calm down, you have a better chance at not drowning. And so basically, I think the practice of contemplation and silence is just a rational way of understanding that if we are left to our own anxieties, we will not be effective and our life will be short. But the practices of contemplation help the outcome, it helps longevity, it helps quality of life, And I think when you bring the concept of God into the picture, like for Tutu, it helps us to move beyond provincial ways of thinking and narrow-mindedness. Now, my own colleagues in theology and in the academy would say, well, hey, religious folks can be the most narrow-minded and the most provincial. And, yeah, I have to say amen to that. That's true. But I think the genius of religion, the genius of spirituality, is the ability to transcend what is apparently a finite point. And if we can get back into those kinds of discussions of being ecumenical and interreligious, because that's where the problem of finitude really occurs, when we think that we have the ultimate answer. But to have the wisdom that we need your answer, that's different from mine, makes us see a much bigger picture than there was before. So the difficulties still remain, but I think spirituality, especially the word that you were using of contemplation, that can help us move beyond the ruts that we often find ourselves in.
You arrive in the country. 2 months later, mercilessly, honey has gone down. You are thrusted into the march in Cape Town.
Yeah.
Now, you similarly have been with Tutu at many of the very dark events. How have you used, and I think it's an important part of having the discussion during the pandemic, how have you used the power of contemplation and purging in itself to be able to outlive those moments? I mean, you would have seen very dark moments. I mean, the massacre in the church in Cape Town, you were there. You were the one that drove to the church and the engagements there. Yeah. And one of the things you talk about is how he prayed. Everything was stopped, but then he got into the car and started continuing to pray. Yeah. How have you personally, and I think it's an important lesson that as we talk about leadership in the modern day, that a lot of people have, they do not take contemplation seriously in a way of being able to purge stress, purge all sorts of other things. But how have you used it to be able to cleanse those difficult times?
It's a good question. And I also just want to reiterate that what we're talking about is not a white European concept. This is really an African embedded practice of contemplation. So I think to talk about COVID for just a while, I think we are in the midst of folks who have been contemplative, who've had times to stop and to see what the accumulation of their habits look like. Many people now realize they were in jobs and not in a career. Many people realize that they really weren't married. They had their own separate lives. And that was a crisis for many marriages, when you have to actually be together. Many people realized that there was no there for their own purpose in life. And so in the United States, we are seeing people who are not going back to the same jobs. And the job economy is really in jeopardy because of that. People are going back to school. Because of the contemplation in COVID-19, they're trying to figure out what they really want to do with their life. So I want to say that in terms of a macro answer to your question. For me personally, it was important for me to be with my family. Because I have a kind of global family, and a daughter who lived in England for a while, and now I'm doing her honors at UCT, so she was over here while we were in the US. I've got a middle daughter who's an artist, and so to find out what the texture of what their visions are now, and a son who's going to be kind of a rock star. I hope he'll pay for my retirement. And then my wife and her visions for, building a hospice in Belize, Central America. It was almost like I was reminded of these passions, creative passions around me that I didn't have the opportunity to really stop and think and know. And I hold that up to everyone who's watching this, that, to take advantage of times in which you have to stop because of the external situation to reevaluate your habits, and especially those that you are the closest to, because oftentimes those are the ones that we take the most for granted.
Now, talking about that and life and family and all of that, I mean, Mama Tutu is one of those people who have been part of our lives for a very long time.
Yeah.
But in her own subtle way, without imposing
Yes.
herself on, what do they call it, on the world stage, doing incredible work and
Yes.
everything else. And the value that her being around during the time when, post the march and when, and how much of that is such a big part of Tutu being able to, because there's moments in that book, even me, despite the fact that I know those moments, because you were there and you describe them not from a far away person type or you were there, you were part of those moments when things had happened and the arch had decided just like that he's going to do something. How much of that was a sense of, I know that my family's got my back on Tutu's life?
It's huge, especially for Mama Leah. She was like some of the biblical rock that the psalmist talks about as the foundation of faith. She was very much that way for the arch. Can you imagine living as the arch and facing the extremes of the ups and the downs, especially leading up to that election, first real election, being the target of people who want to take you out? Can you imagine if you didn't have a foundation like Mama Leah? Or can you imagine if it was someone who was so full of anxieties that they were not any kind of bedrock for you because they were so caught up in their own anxieties? So Mama Leah was, as the arch would say, I mean, without her, his longevity never would have occurred. So similar to his prayer life, the relationship he had with Mama Leah was a powerful resource for a quality of life as well as a quantity of life for the arch. Yeah, so I think her humility, her way of hospitality, she welcomed me. When I went to live with the arch during those years, she was so hospitable, letting me use her car. So I think Mama Leah is someone who needs another book on her. So I say that to those of you out there. We need a good book on her life.
That is a life that we need to tell a good story about.
Yeah.
Because I know from my own mother, my own wife, and how they worry about us. Right up until today, at my age and what I do and everything else, my mother still worries about me.
Yeah.
And every one of the people who you see who are successful are a product of their mother's prayer.
Oh my goodness.
And that is one of the most important things that we need to tell the story about in Africa. Now, I want to get to the illumination, because amazingly enough, this time goes quite fast.
We're just on the first part of purgation, right?
First part of purgation. While we're in purgation, the arch becomes a Nobel laureate. Now, for him getting there, non-violence, but preaching sanctions at the same time, there would have been a higher power that's guiding him, because I am sitting here as a business leader and trying to balance the number of things that are trying to keep a country from imploding and exploding and being in fire, traveling internationally, and trying to get more countries, including the US, to impose very strong sanctions on the apartheid government. And at the same time, there's your own life. Self-preservation is part of all of us. Yeah. Now, it is one of those things that maybe I think in the next book, you need to explore a little bit more, because I kept on, eventually I got to a point where I was saying, but it must be a higher power than that. Because
in terms of how to keep it all together.
How to keep it all together, because it's there's too many moving parts.
But I think that's why his prayer life was so important. To every day, pray at least 3 times a day. And I was talking with John Allen, the biographer of the Arch. And we were trying to count up the amount of times that he would pray. We came up to about 7 times a day. So that's not a luxury. Trying to keep it all together requires, it's like a duck on the water. You just see the duck and it seems like it's all still and contemplative. But underneath that water, those ducks are moving in a very rapid pace just to be able to tread water. So I think the contemplative life gave him the vision of how to keep it all together. But I think it helped to create a non-anxious presence. And that non-anxious presence is really how you get things done. Because if you're not non-anxious, you either burn out because of the anxiety will just make you explode, or this dysfunctional anxiety will make you act out, whether that's through scandal or whether that just takes away the authority that people have been giving to you as a leader.
Now, and that is an important conversation, because in the world where everything it's volatile, uncertain, and we speak about VUCA and all of that, and that to a great degree. I'm an engineer by training, so by its nature, engineering models are very simple, and the model in itself is there are variables you'll allow to move, and then there are the ones that you'll keep stable so that you can make a sense of the world. But
if you get anything wrong, then everything falls apart.
But that is exactly what kept on troubling me about the point at which, we just before the Arch won, the Nobel Peace Prize, that is exactly, he could have just simply collapsed the economy and plunged the entire. So that's exactly what we were trying to fight for, not plunge a country into a civil war.
Right. And
that could have easily happened, because suddenly people have no food, they have no, there's a whole lot of things that happen when a country collapses.
Yeah.
And I am grateful for his own life and for his prayer and those who prayed for him, because at that point in time, how do you keep all of that juggled together? I mean, in today's world, and as you look at the difficulty of trying to deal with COVID, deal with, the challenges of businesses that are not doing very well, unemployment, a whole lot of things that are just there. And there's a lot leaders can learn from the book in itself, in being able to look at a life like that and understand how complex it would have been. A lot of us, as you say, a fish doesn't know that it's wet. A lot of us were not aware of how much went into actually achieving liberation.
And how you would have performed if you were the Arch during those times. We just don't know. But as I try to think about what you're saying in terms of how the Arch was able to hold things together, as I try to imagine his life, like in 1984 when he got the Nobel Peace Prize, my worry would have been for the Arch that it would have gone to his head and he would have, taken that branding of a Nobel Peace Prize and used it for his own gain. During those states of emergency in the 80s, Nelson Mandela was out of sight, out of mind in terms of media. That's sort of the slogan for the media. You gotta, even if it's bad press, you just need to keep getting pressed to have the attention of the public. But for this kind of biblical figure of Nelson Mandela, people were beginning to forget about him. They knew he was kind of this saintly figure in prison for justice. And easily, some of the leaders could have tried to take advantage of that, become opportunists. Tutu could have tried to, just take that as a mandate from the world that he should be trying to lead or go into, try to run for public office. But he had the wisdom, like in the Bible, John the Baptist stepped away to allow Jesus to lead. Tutu had the wisdom and the habits to know his place and to support as best he could Mandela's witness and to point to him, even though he wasn't getting as much press. So what I imagine that, I think that was a struggle that we don't think about, that Tutu had to go through to relinquish the mandate from the world in a way that would go to his ego. I think most of us, I'm not sure how we would have handled that. Can you imagine the money that you could have made, the endorsements, the folks who would have tried to get you to do what they wanted to do politically, and to resist that, and to have the humility to know that certain leaders really needed to be in place. And we also have to keep in mind those in exile. So many of these leaders had to leave South Africa, and so many of the Black political organizations could not function in full mode in the 80s.
But Michael, can you speak about Tutu's mysticism without speaking about his political genius?
I don't think you can separate the two. I think the wisdom of how to engage the polis, from which politics comes from that word. Polis is really the people, the aggregate of people that gather together that looks like a city. But it's not literally a city. It's, whenever you have two or three, you've got politics. And that's the kind of sense of what politics is it's the gathering of people's interests, commitments. And so for Tutu, when you have people who are gathered together, not just physically, but their interests and their commitments, you have to have some mystical element of making those differences orbit around each other and not planets colliding. And so to me, that was the genius of his mysticism, is to help people to see that even if your interests are not my interest, we have to see how our interests can collide, can work together for a larger outcome, that we are more than the sum of our parts. To me, that's mysticism.
And similarly, the Archer's single-mindedness, and to me, that's one of those things that I marvel at, his ability to be able to say, I am trying to achieve this one goal, and this one goal alone, and his ability to probably see opportunity. And I think we, as they call it, beyond understanding the spirituality of Desmond Tutu, as you read through the book, you get to be able to realize that single-mindedness of, even in business, does not come just like that. Yeah. It's the ability to connect the dots very quickly. Because when you look at him, Honey dies, and he goes and speaks. And at that point in time, there's this conflict between, communistic views of, atheistic views and all of that. And some people are saying, but why would you go and speak at a communist funeral? But then at that funeral, he makes something incredible. He brings down the war cry that then eventually in those last few months becomes everything we did. It's, when do we want freedom? We want it now. Yes. When do we want, liberation? It's now. Yeah. Now,
and this is a church leader saying this,
yes.
Right?
He he knew when to toggle between the two areas. And to me, is in any of the times that you've been together with him, have you ever marveled at somebody and you got to a point where you had to ask the question, but how did you know that that was going to work that well?
No, I think you're right. I like the word, the single-mindedness. That's the connotation is that's a virtue, not a single-mindedness. That's a narrow-mindedness, but someone who's able to focus.
It's like I know, like I know, like I know.
Yeah.
It is that sense of belief. When I say talking about single-mindedness, that sense of belief that
Yeah.
that is the goal.
Yeah, it's like Tutu had an epiphany that gave him this focus, almost like from God. And I think that's the power. And I think that power can easily be abused. And that's why I go back to saying how many of us really would have been responsible with power. But he was able, I think, again, through purgation, he was trained to learn to be detached from power and to give it over. Not many of us could hold on to power for a while and then give it over. Or not many of us could hold on to power and try to take advantage of it as best we could while we had it. But I think it's a great model for leadership. But a leader can't just think, okay, I'm strong enough, I'm single-minded enough that I can handle power. No human being can really handle power. Power has to be negotiated, and there has to be accountability, and there has to be community. People have to know that they can trust you with power. In other words, they have to know that you're willing to give it away. That's really what it comes down to. But most of us are not willing to give it away. And I think that's why I can't separate the Christian mysticism from politics. Because in Christian mysticism, you're taught to give it away. First, purgation, illumination, and union. Along that threefold process, you're being taught to give power away so that you can live fully with God. Because God sees not just what we wanted God to see, God sees our hearts. And if our hearts are still caught up in sort of hiding power, that's eventually going to be seen also in the world.
I'm talking about this mysticism and as it is said in the scriptures, those who are last will be put first and those who are first will be put last.
Yeah.
Now, every time he tried to recede back
Yes.
into the background,
He could
was
never
always
retire.
thrusted back forward.
Yeah.
And I think it's an important lesson that one gleans from the book itself. Because right there and there he says, Nelson Mandela is now our leader and he will lead and I will recede back into, my charitable work and the things that I want to do. But right there and there, Nelson Mandela says, I've got an important job for you.
Right.
I need you to be the world, the nation's confessor.
Yes. And I think you're helping us with making it through the methodology of the book, because we're in illumination now. And that single-mindedness is a part of that illumination, the focus, to be able to have the vision for what to do. That's illumination. Yeah, and I think when he couldn't retire, I think Mandela had that wisdom that there's no better person for the authority. The difference between authority and power is people give you authority. You can't create authority by yourself. People give you authority. And from that authority, you're able to implement things and make things happen. That's power. And I think the wisdom for someone like Mandela is that people had given Tutu authority. And Mandela had given Tutu authority, just based on what I was trying to say about being out of sight, out of mind, and seeing Tutu's way of making sure that Mandela was going to be the leader. That was brilliant, I think, on Tutu's part. And then I think the illumination of the TRC, of not being another quagmire of the Middle East. That's illumination. That's a way of seeing how to move forward. But you had to have the purgation first.
Now, in essence, the TRC comes through and the report is written And the last act of Mandela's presidency is for him to, gazette the report itself. Now, a lot of leaders struggle with a simple thing. What comes next? So a lot of people are willing to let go, but for you to go through this process, how does the arch navigate never fusing his Tutu the self and Tutu the person who's supposed to do something?
Yeah.
And that's an important conversation, because as we speak about that,
It is important.
To me, it's not a linear process that you go from purgation, illumination, and then the union.
Yes.
It's an iterative process.
That's correct.
Is that the right insight that I'm taking from the book?
No, that's correct. It's not linear. You're right. It's sort of conflated on each other. They're all sort of on the same level, and you can live in two at a time, or you can live at three at the same time. I think the wisdom that you're bringing us is that Tutu never disassociated his authenticity and his leadership of the TRC. He led the hearings with the Lord's Prayer, right? This is a governmental hearing. Usually you don't do that, right? He wore his bishop's cassock. I think that's what grounded him, to be able to try to provide a personal authenticity, that he's not trying to be someone he's not, but he's also trying to lead a commission to bring out the truth. And so he is a confessor. A confessor, for those who are not acquainted with a lot of these religious terms, really comes from sort of the Roman Catholic tradition of giving a confession. So most of us have at least seen it on TV in the Godfather movies, of going and sitting in a confessional and telling the priest who can't see you what your sins are. So the priest is the confessor. The priest is the one hearing the confession. And so that's the reason I have in the title Tutu as confessor. And I think Tutu was able to stay grounded because he wasn't hiding from his identity. And also I think the world gave him, or South Africa gave him, authority for how he used his church leadership to help South Africa give birth to democracy. And just as an aside here, I'm obviously a religious person in an institution called Christianity. And the institution of the church, it does not have an absolutely positive history. And many of the occasions in church history, the dysfunction of leadership made matters worse instead of being a part of the solution. And I just want to hold up Tutu's life, and that's one of the reasons I wrote this biography, because here is a life that's a part of the solution. Here's someone who represents the institutional church that actually did some good, as opposed to a Monty Python movie of what the church looks like, or as opposed to all the scandals in the church. Here is an institutional church leader that was able to work in a secular world in a positive way. And we don't see that very often.
Beyond him being guided by the Lord and, a higher power, to me, I think what is important, and I think in both politics and in leadership, is for people to know when to go. And that was an important part. But before he goes, he does something miraculous. He takes on truth and reconciliation commissions all over the world. And at that point in time, but before we get there, and when we get to the next part of the book, which is, the part where he becomes an elder and all of that, there's a moment that we all remember during the TRC, where the arch breakdowns and cries. And to me, I think it's a reminder that it's an iterative process.
Yeah.
Because, crying reminds you you're alive. It is a big part of what do they call it, of spirituality. And I think with what do they call it, with some of the challenges we have in the country, with gender-based violence and all sorts of other things based on, you know, men don't cry and all sorts of other things. But he upholds the moment. He is, you know, the sense of what he's just had is,
Yeah.
you know, even for him who had gone through, you know, seeing a lot of difficulty in South Africa, that was too much.
Yes. That's powerful and appropriate for a leader who is the recipient of this tragic news that's occurring in these hearings, and to somehow be a stoic in the midst of that. You know, that would have been horrendous in terms of leadership. And for him to respond appropriately through the vulnerability of tears really shows humanity. And there is another Christian mystic that says, her pseudonym is Maggie Ross. She says tears are a sign of God's presence because tears represents this surrender to this emotional surrender that makes us more vulnerable to God. So I think you're pointing to that scene in those hearings is a powerful one for Tutu's leadership.
Now, if a mere mortal like me would not take on another tears, but he goes on to probably take on 10, 12 of them.
But to be fair, it was reluctant. I mean, if Nelson Mandela asked you to do something, what would you do? So, I mean, so it's not like he was seeking. He really wanted to retire. He wasn't seeking these other opportunities. Tutu also realized he was about the only one that could really have the authority to make this work.
Ultimately, now he's a world leader. And
so we're moved from purgation, illumination, which really, illumination was mostly about the TRC and the vision for how to proceed.
Before we leave illumination, there is an important sense that the Arch brings in the sense that it is not the victim alone that needs to be free. As I was driving here, I was playing a song that, what do they call it, that has the Arch's voice in it. And he says, "We are the Rainbow Nation.
Yeah.
We are free. All of us, white and black."
Yeah.
Now, it's his sense of freedom is interesting, and it's an interesting worldview because even with a lot of leaders, there was either a fight for certain people to be free, and everybody else didn't matter.
Right.
And in certain cases, that's what led to genocide, led to a lot of other things. But he remained steadfast in his belief that it needed to be. I think it is his words or Mandela's words that says, "Freedom for one is not freedom for all. It's freedom for. We have to enable everybody to be free." Now, beyond that, I mean, he's now illuminated. He understands that, and now he gives it to the world.
Yeah, in gaming theory, a lot of the explanation is that in order to win, you win based on someone else losing. So in gaming theory, it's called zero-sum game. You win based on the other having to lose. But the spirituality of Tutu was not to allow that to be his methodology of leadership in fighting apartheid. So it wasn't that for black people to win, white people have to lose. It was to really be a human being. We have to be able to use our differences for the greater good. So it wasn't a zero-sum game. That got Tutu in trouble from both sides, the black and the white side. But he resisted this gaming theory of a zero-sum game. And I think it's important for leaders today, because most leaders today are socialized or brainwashed into a zero-sum game. Our economies are brainwashed into zero-sum outcomes. And I think spirituality in many ways can help not only politics, but can help our economics, can help us to think differently about who wins.
As we reimagine the world coming out of COVID, for us as African, as we are implementing the Africa Free Trade Agreement, Continental Free Trade Agreement, what can we take from this that would be actually, as we say, in economics and everywhere else, allow us to thrive? And then as I'm thinking, and I was going through the book, and there was another book that we were reviewing a few weeks back that talks about, Africa bounces back. And to me, there's a lot in this book that allows us to be able to see that greater worldview that allows us to be able to, what can we take from this in terms of the pandemic itself? And because for me, a pandemic allows us to reset. It allows us to be able to, that button that we thought didn't exist suddenly just out of nowhere appeared.
That's a good way to put it, yeah. I think South Africa can learn to remain a global nation because the world for quite a while was looking at what was happening in South Africa and the nonviolent means of international sanctions, the ways in which, you had leaders that go from Gandhi to, Nelson Mandela. Those weren't just leaders for South Africa, they're leaders for the whole world. I would take advantage of that branding. People may think, okay, here's this clergy person talking about marketing and branding. I think Jesus understood marketing and branding. And I think if you use it correctly to help really show what's valuable in the world, then it's used correctly. And I think South Africa needs to take advantage of its international reputation after COVID, because COVID made us really see firsthand that there really are no borders, right? I mean, existentially, we had a come to Jesus moment that all of this stuff that we're making up basically about nation states and boundaries and borders, it's really artificial and it's a construct. So I think South Africa, in terms of a nation state, has moral authority on a global scale. So for South Africa to be more involved with the UN, more involved with these global economic institutions like the World Bank and IMF, I think that's one thing coming out of COVID, for South Africa to realize that it has an international branding. And then I think this way of handling the transitions of moving from whatever totalitarian, fascist, all these ways of trying to run governments based on dysfunctional ideologies, moving from that into what we're trying to call as a healthy democracy. Usually the transition is a huge danger because most nation states don't really survive it, and they stay in a quagmire of violence. But for South Africa to come alongside some of these other nation states in the world, like Afghanistan and the Middle East, and the Arch got involved in the Middle Eastern situation, and again, he got in trouble from both sides as he was saying the word apartheid makes sense in what is going on in the Middle East. So I'm hoping, especially in the conversation we're having now, that some of those leaders out there who are listening to us can first of all be proud of this nation of South Africa, and then secondly, not to be smug in thinking that a leader is someone is the leadership is really about you, because it's not. So much of a leader is about what people are giving to you, are projecting upon you, and hoping from you. And if your habits aren't good, and if you don't really have a spiritual grounding, the cliche always is true: power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
The Arch, as a co-founding member of the elders, and now his friendship with the Dalai Lama,
Yeah.
and the Arch, in the beginning when the book starts and you start talking about mysticism and, the heroic sense, or what do they call it, of Tutu,
Yeah.
saying, well, I think Michael is clutching here, but let's see.
Let's see where he's gonna go.
But where it's gonna go. But as the book goes, then this mystic you talk about is brilliantly crafted, and I also got a sense that you were trying to balance,
Yeah.
your adoration for your leader and what do they call it, and being a disciple, with being able to have a very strong book that talks to the essence.
Yeah.
But time and again, you come back to the concept of Ubuntu and being able to build it in the global sense. Are we winning in being able to have the world understands I and thou?
Yeah.
Are we winning? Are we making ground on this? And that's one of those things I'll say. Now that I know you, I want to hold you accountable for getting that concept of I and thou. Even if people might not be able to understand Ubuntu,
That's key.
and I and thou. And as we come out of the pandemic, could we actually find a world that goes away from? We're not saying the individual does not matter, but the individual can only be if we are all are.
Yeah, I think, Seppo, starting out in the book, I realized that some people would be turned off because I was making a claim that Tutu is a saint. Yeah, so I'm glad that you kept reading to the end. But I think what I meant by saint, and we're talking about the last stage of Christian mysticism, and that's union. We went from purgation to illumination to this last stage of union. And what I mean is, I think Tutu is closer to being one with God, either through an elder naturally having more wisdom than this young upstart person who thinks that they can conquer the world, or an elder is someone whose habits have accumulated in such a way that they can show the world how to live. And in our sort of egalitarian democratic society that's being influenced by individualism, and that's here in South Africa too, we often do not want to admit that some people are further along spiritually than others. And I do want to say that some people are further along, and we need to be able to confess that, and that no one is arrived, no one is perfect. But we can all be saints. We can all thrive in the unity of aligning our wills with God's will. So the union aspect of the biography is how Tutu seems to be closer with that alignment. So for example, being an Anglican, right? And his best friend being a Buddhist. Tutu, in his sort of unitive stage, realizes the arbitrary nature of what we call denominational Christianity, the institutional church, and then there's something really greater in religion than these demarcations we put on religion. And so Tutu's relationship with the Dalai Lama really shows this kind of union with God's will, that God doesn't want us to have all these denominations and all of these constructs, nation states, denominations, different religions. Sure, God wants us to be different, and that's the reason why we have these particularities, but God doesn't want that to be the sticking point, to cause wars, for us to call each other names, and most of all, for us not to be in proximity to one another. Tutu is modeling this union stage in his elder years.
But Michael, I've got somebody there probably can hear the thought in their head. How does this idealistic view of life, permeate beyond? I'm reminded as we are going towards the Arch's birthday in 2 days' time, I'm reminded of the South African government denying the Dalai Lama a visa. Just because China said you will not recognize Tibet.
Right.
Now there's geopolitics. There's somebody out there who's going, there's geopolitics, and in this union that you're calling for, how do we navigate the geopolitics? Because at the current moment, in the idealism that we're talking about, that is part of our life.
That's a good point. And as we're coming closer to the end of our conversation, I just want these younger generations that do not know about Tutu to realize that this seemingly idealism is a part of youth as well. Most revolutions around the world are led by young people, and they have an idealism of the way the world should be. And so idealism is not a bad thing. It's a bad thing when it becomes dysfunctional and delusional. But if you're single-minded and you've got focus and you've got good habits, you can change the world with that idealism. The union stage for Tutu, I think, is he's trying to model what that change looks like. So, first of all, ecumenism, or interreligious ways of being spiritually, that's a key thing. So instead of us seeing in a religious way of seeing that different religions have to be, but to be challenged with, okay, what does God really think about how we're practicing religions? To think of it that way. And then I think this union stage, I'm hoping for younger people to respect the elder. And in South Africa, there's more of a culture to do that. But I'm wondering what you think about what I'm about to say. I think it's in demise. I think the respect for the elder is going by the wayside because individualism through technology, we're becoming so insular by just wanting to be in our sort of social media circles and our echo chambers and our affinity groups. Technology is hurting us in that kind of a way. That we've lost the habit of respecting the elder because we're in our own authority. We think we got the knowledge. So I'm hoping that this last stage of the elder can be appreciated more by the younger world. That I'm afraid, even in South Africa, I'm afraid they may not know about Tutu's life and his impact.
Last Friday was World Smile Day. I got to find out, and I got onto a conference call for now, Tutu's humor.
Another book, really.
It's such a great part of the man, and to me is what do they call it? His afterward and his question is the ramen coke in heaven.
Right.
I get the urge to actually have the last word. And I'm thinking, yes, Michael, he has written such a beautiful book, and I'm saying, all he could say is thank you, Michael, but he just still one moment. He's always one ahead. Now, in essence, his humor has always been part of what has helped him through.
It disarms.
Yes.
It helps people. When you laugh, you're moving towards consensus. And that's the gift of humor. And I think some of the best communicators in the world is a stand-up comedian. You take somebody from a lack of affect, a lack of emotion, to a full belly laugh with tears fluent. That's a brilliant communicator.
Now, in business, and I can even hear probably one of the leaders out there going, but how do I maintain my sense of leadership? And I think that's an important point I take away from the book. The sense of leadership does not have to be authoritative or authoritarian. Yeah. It can actually, and I think let's go a little bit into that in the sense of, Tutu's humor, his disarmingness, and the ability to just simply And, I know I have to go to the questions here. The road of the rabbit and the lion. The story that, what do they call it? I'm actually impressed in what do they call it, in you telling the story
Yeah.
in the book. I want to see the questions as they're coming through. Yes. So in essence, as we are, oh no, there is life there. We were now
That's
getting
good.
10 questions.
Good to hear.
But anyway, so in essence, I've got a leader out there that's probably asking themselves is, how do I draw the line? And
Yeah. Well, I hope you have Taniko Maluke here on your show.
Yeah.
He's the one who gave me the narrative of the lion and the rabbit.
Yeah.
I think what we have to do is to have humility. And humility helps us with the disarming of our egos. Because when you're laughing, that's not a very elegant thing to do, because you disarmed yourself when you're laughing. But I think the key for us is how we move forward. So the cliches. It's not you're falling down, right? It's you're getting up, and I think that's the moment we are in history, and that's the way we're going to be as human beings, because we're naturally going to fall down. But we've got to have the tenacity to keep getting up. And that's why we need leaders. Because we can either have leaders who want us to stay down, or leaders who want us to think that by falling or weakness that you can't really be human. But that only exacerbates the problems of moving forward. And politics is infamous for always looking backward. We need to move forward.
Somebody is asking here, as we go to the questions. Bishop Tutu, in his book titled God is Not Christian, shows us the universal God is, and how narrow and defined can be. Any thoughts on this, in us being able to say God is not Christian?
Yeah, I mean, I know that's a provocative title, but even for Christians, did Jesus call himself a Christian?
It's a title.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that was constructed after Jesus' life. So it's not heretical. The title is not heretical to say God is not a Christian, because descriptively through history, that's a name that we put onto Jesus. I think we shouldn't be afraid of the other. We shouldn't be afraid of other religions like Buddhism. In fact, Buddhism is really what made the word spirituality famous. We should embrace that. We should embrace our particularity. Also, if you are a Christian, if you are a Buddhist, if you are a Hindu, you should embrace the particularity of what you have grown up in. But do not see that as the end. Try to learn, like Gandhi taught, how to see someone outside of your religion as a friend. And just start there. Keep your particularity, but do not set up a false enemy, because it is a false enemy for someone who is trying to love God in their particular way, and to see them as an enemy. So I think it takes work, it takes education, it takes being in proximity to those who are differently religious than we are. But I think it takes humility also.
With you, time and again having a chance to bring seminarians down to Cape Town and meet the Arch, you've probably had moments, and the Arch is very reflective in his state of union about death and the end of, what do they call it, of his life. Yeah. The question here is, what do you think the Arch's thoughts of? And knowing him, he's probably not really thought through about his legacy. Yeah. And the second question is, how are we going to keep that legacy going? And the question I've asked everybody who's sat down in that chair is that, how do we create more? Not
Yeah.
more of the same, but more in the same mold.
Right. I think it's a good question, and that's the reason that I'm concerned about the young people knowing the Arch. First of all, it's hard to get the Arch to talk about his legacy. And I think it goes back to what I was saying about his spirituality. You know, really deeply spiritual people don't try to talk so much about their spirituality. They try to show it. They try to show their spirituality. And I think for the legacy part, I think he's going to be known for his chairing the TRC. I think he's going to be known for Ubuntu. I think he's going to be known for spirituality that does not separate political witness. I think he's going to be known for how humor can disarm a crowd. I think he's going to be known for that. But I'm just afraid, because of what I was saying, that he was hit from both sides in terms of many black folks saw him as idealistic, and what happened about reparations and that sort of argument in the TRC, and then many white people afraid of his leadership to bring down the empire. And so I'm just afraid that there are forces that are going to try to cancel out his legacy. That's my fear. But courage is what we should be living on, and not fear. And so that's what I'm hoping, especially as young people. As I say, that's the gift of youth, is idealism. So if you really want to know idealism that can actually lead to outcomes, study Tutu's life and see the magnificent outcomes that he has given to South Africa.
The Arch has always been outspoken. Given the state of the nation where it is now, we have all our own views about where the nation is. Yeah. Some of us more dire than others. But if given a chance, and he was still of great health, yeah, what do you think he would say about where the nation is right now?
Well, he'd encourage the nation, because lacking self-esteem only makes matters worse, not just for individuals, but for groups and for communities. So it would encourage that we have survived so far an apocalyptic event of COVID. We're trying to address the issues of infrastructure and economics. So he would have an encouraging voice, but he would, I'm just guessing, but having been a student of his for quite a while, he would say we're not finished, and we can't become content with what we have accomplished, and that we have to continue to move forward. And my word of habits, hopefully, that you've been hearing me continue to say through our conversation, he would encourage the habits to be worked on in our individual lives as well as in our communal lives that would help us move forward to where we should be.
From the blessing of having to be and live in and around the Arch, what are the 5 lessons that Michael Battle took from the relationship and still continues to take? Because I don't think the Arch could be somebody you could learn from. As I said in the beginning, he is vast like the sands of what do they call it, of the Kalahari.
Yeah, he's got so much. I think first, say your prayers. In my book launches, that's one of the things I've been trying to use as a mantra. Say your prayers, something simple like that. And what I mean by that is not simply in some kind of Sunday school religious way, but the way we were talking in our conversation about being contemplative, embracing silence, not seeing silence as an enemy, taking a deep breath, learning how to be non-anxious in a healthy way. So I think saying your prayers is one of the things that I've learned from the Arch. The concept of Ubuntu, being this amphibian, starting our conversation, I understood as a Western person, the most important thing was me being an individual. I may not say that out loud, but the way that I would act, what's the most important thing is my self-interest. But learning from Tutu this concept of Ubuntu, and I am because you are, and because you are, I am, learning that existentially helped to take me out of a American individualistic worldview. I think the third one is learning from Tutu that politics and religion need not be oil and water, and that they can coexist in ways to bring healthy outcomes. And I think in many ways it's a false dichotomy anyway to have a difference between religion and politics. I think fourth, his focus on issues matter. As you're saying, this vast, overwhelming life of Tutu and all the things that he addressed as an outspoken person, but I think each of us, we all have a calling to address specific issues just because of our own contexts. So I would say that learning to know what those issues are and having a positive way of addressing them, not just with our words, but in our actions. And then I think lastly, I think Tutu's way of being a global citizen, mostly because of his non-violent way of addressing apartheid, but learning to be a global citizen. If you have a chance of traveling, really try to do that.
Now, we've got a question here that is quite interesting to me, but it's, I still say, read the book, you'll find out, but we will attempt to answer the question in a short space of time that we have, In Africa, it says we can talk until cows come home, and they are coming home. So at some point in time, we will have to continue this conversation later. Now, what kind of a leader, in your words, is the Archbishop? And what can we infuse into today's leadership?
I think he's what I'm trying to argue in this book is that he's a spiritual leader, but not in the negative way that comes across today in our world. A spiritual leader tends to be apolitical in our kind of world today. A spiritual leader tends to be irrelevant to the issues of the day. A spiritual leader tends to be sort of individualistic, of trying to get your own personal journey together, that kind of thing. But what I mean by spiritual leader for Tutu is that it's a way of understanding an authenticity of bringing together where your deep gladness meets the world's deep hunger. And I think that's spirituality, not seeing yourself only as an individual, but seeing yourself as a communal person. And so a spiritual leader is how I would describe Tutu, but I think that's what we need in the world today. We need leaders that are not afraid of having these conversations that we're having right now.
Each one of us are a letter to the world. Each one of us have to find their own message. Now, the question here says, Tutu states that in my theology there's no ordinary people. What are your thoughts on that sense and that worldview? It is a highly empowering, but and I want you to probably start it off from your initial culture perspective, where you from coming from the US and the individual matters and this and that, but then bring it back to how can one embrace that oneness of Ubuntu as you look at your message, because all of us have a message.
I think we have to see that and this is what Tutu said a lot, we are invaluable. And what that means is there is no value that anybody can place on you. You are beyond value. You are more than value. And that's important for us. And again, that takes us back to spirituality. So many of us operate out of a lack of self-esteem, and we don't know we're valuable, whether that's from incidents that have happened in our life or from the worldview that we've developed. But if we know that we are valuable and that each other is valuable, we are closer to some of these idealistic things that we think can never occur. So if we can develop a worldview that each of us really, really matter, that sense of being a team and cooperating together will begin to flow. Politics, economics, religion. But if we think we do not matter, we also project that upon others. And then that leads to war, abuse, racism, and so on. Tutu sums it up by saying, we're made in the image of God. And so that shows you that's beyond human value. We are inextricably tied to each other in a way that no person can place a price tag on another human being.
When you achieve union and oneness with God, it is impossible for you not to see another person. It is impossible for you to not be able to, because there is no way that you're not seeing God.
Right.
Now, a lot of our leaders do not have that understanding. And the old, what do they call it, teachings and how people were raised in leadership was, you gotta be above everybody. What are your lessons, or the Arch's lessons for the world in achieving the union? And remember, you opened the chapter with saying that the proverbial saying, we can only achieve oneness with God in the afterlife, and I must say I've enjoyed your style of writing, because it's an argument. Even you yourself, even you yourself, as you read through this, you're going, okay, so this is the argument. But then as we go on, then we unpack that and pull it apart, and then ultimately we get to a point. Now, we go back to the idea of idealistic, the saint, the mystic, the ultimate spiritual leader. But as we say, what are your thoughts on doing that? On achieving, in its simple scale? Because, sometimes I always say it's in the relations that you have that you can actually be able to build up.
Yeah, I think when you were talking about God, I think the problem is which God and whose God, because we often use God for our own agendas. And great sociologists taught us that most of our gods is just an accumulation of human ideas or the way that we want God to serve our purposes. I think the way we move forward in spirituality is taking seriously that, I'm dependent on you. We saw this in COVID, right? If your actions are such that you don't really believe in wearing a mask or whatever, well, those actions have direct repercussions on me. And I think the more that we understand that existentially, that I depend on you, without that being considered a weakness or codependency is a negative word, the better off we are. But it's hard for us to do that unless we are somehow debilitated or somehow in a tragedy to really know that to be conscious that we are dependent on others. And I think when we practice our understanding of happiness, happiness is a practice, by the way. We are happy based on the things that we like to do. So we do those things to try to be happy, to go fishing, to watch our favorite TV show. That's a habit that in order to practice happiness. And I think we need to expand that habit beyond the superficial happiness that we have. So happiness really shouldn't be dependent on watching your favorite TV show. We should really expand happiness being able to help someone move out of poverty, or a young person who's not able to pass a test. That should be the criteria for happiness, as opposed to the superficial ways that we have learned to be happy.
We've got two more last questions. One is big, but let's start with that one. In a nutshell, or in your conversation with Arch, when he reflects, and being somebody who's reflective, what are his failures in his own view? And he says clearly to you right in the beginning of the book that we are all on the road to Esmao.
Yeah.
What are his views about of the things that he could have patched more?
Yeah.
Yes.
I think we're just learning from the Arch and being around him and listening to some of the things he would say about that in terms of his own weaknesses. I think our strengths are our weaknesses. There's always a shadow side to whatever our strength is. So, for example, if I'm really operating out of my right brain and I'm a creative writer, I write poetry, whatever, that means that the weakness is that I'm not doing what you're doing as an engineer. My left brain is not functioning as well. So I think Tutu would say, just his own way of practicing forgiveness. I remember he told a story about really struggling to forgive someone. I think those are the kinds of things that he would say he's always had to work on in his life as a weakness. I think for us, that's the same thing. I think our weaknesses, we should see them in that kind of Jungian psychotherapy model of usually our strengths are our weaknesses, and that can help us not to be so egotistical about our strengths. Use our strengths, but to know that we also need to be ambidextrous. If we're right-handed, we need to really practice using our left hand. Right-brained, I need to go and read some of those engineering books that you've got. The struggle for us is to be balanced. So our weaknesses can also be our strengths. So it's the other way around, too.
The last question, and I'm serious, this is the last, and I see them coming through. What is your hope for this book and this biography? And as you do that, tell us more about the Peace Battle Academy.
Yeah, sure. I think we've already talked about it. I'm just afraid that, the Arch's integrity of speaking truth to power while he was fighting apartheid, and also in the democracy of South Africa, him being a thorn in the side of those in power, have led to some people trying to cancel him out, to cancel out his legacy, as well as the sort of white, privileged, entitlement kinds of folks who are not always speaking favorably of Tutu's legacy because of how he spoke out against them as well. So my fear is that, and I want this book to hold up what I think of as one of his greatest parts of his legacy, and that's his spiritual life. I think what we need to do, all of us, is to have a legacy. And for every human being to think about when we're gone, what is it that we will have left behind that is of value? And so to create habits so that that will accumulate what that legacy will be.
And
A
a bit
peace
about
battle.
the Peace Battle. Okay.
Peace Battle Institute is basically a legal way for me to receive honoraria for the books that I write, the speaking engagement. But I love the sort of literary twist of Peace Battle because it represents my name, and also it's a way, a legal sort of corporation of trying to address issues academically as well as theologically. So one of the things that I want to write, and hopefully when I finish this, you'll have me back, is called Theophany. It's a book in which the ozone layer collapses, and the richest people on earth are going to be Black people because we can live longer with the collapsed ozone layer.
Thank you, Dr. Battle.
Thank you.
In Africa, we say, when land had been sold and it has been transferred in full and title has transferred, we pick up a piece of soil from the ground and from the heart of the land, and we transfer it to the new owner. If we were outside, I would intentionally take a piece of ground and welcome you back home and allow you to be able to claim this land as your own. Thank you for a beautiful book.
Thank you. And thank you for the time and the interest and the careful reading that you had of the book.
And thank you to everybody who put all of this together, viewer and, careful preparation.
Yes, very much.
And I hope she never has a heart attack because you were inspired. And making sure that you make it safely here. And thank you to the publishers of the book themselves. And them taking a very abstract concept and allowing you to publish when a lot of people were saying this won't sell.
Right.
And it's not about selling. And thank you for allowing us to have one more look. It's not one last look because I know you've got another book coming. One additional look at a hero. In Africa, we don't tell enough of our own stories and tell enough about what has to be done. And thank you for taking the time for doing all of that. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much.